Hey! In the early 1920s, the Soviet leadership was eager to spread the revolution beyond the areas of the old Russian Empire. Initially, all focus was on Europe, but their gaze soon turned towards the east. While far less industrially developed than Europe, India and China held larger populations and had huge untapped revolutionary potential. Suffering under imperialist and colonialist exploitation, the news of the Russian Revolution gave hope for change for radicals all across the world. The Soviets were not going to miss out on the opportunity to spread their revolutionary ideas, and especially China quickly became the central stage in the drama of world revolution. In my previous video, I discussed the internationalism at the core of the Soviet Union's early ideology. The Union was not to be bound by specific geographical limits, and it openly promoted revolutions abroad. The Communist International, or the Comintern, was the primary organization coordinating these efforts. In this video, we will first look at how the Bolsheviks broadened their initial Marxist theory of revolution based on their own experiences in 1918. A key concept was the two-stage revolution, which claimed to establish a scientific path from pre-modern societies to socialism. After discussing the underlying theory, we will look at how it was exported abroad through the Comintern. The main policy after 1922 was called the United Front, a call for alliance between communists and other progressive forces, from nationalists to liberals, against imperialism and feudalism. It became especially famous in its manifestation in China, and that will be the main example in this video, as we will look at why the strategy was used in China specifically and how it worked out. Lastly, we will take a closer look at the exact terminology, specifically what differentiates the United Front from another similar term, the Popular Front. In short, the video will cover why and how the Comintern attempted to promote revolution, especially in China, how well these attempts worked and how they were received by the locals, and, finally, what were the immediate consequences. So, let's dive in. The two-stage revolution theory. Marx initially predicted that only countries that have developed capitalism and have a sizable proletarian class could have socialist revolutions. Lenin developed this further, saying that the capitalist world system would most likely start to crack from its less developed periphery, as occurred in Russia in 1917. The Russians therefore adopted policies based on their own experience when sending advice to the so-called backward countries that were still stuck under some form of feudalism, colonialism, or monarchy. Already in 1919, the failure of the German Revolution had pushed Lenin to start turning his hopes from Europe to the East. Considering that Russia had been able to have a revolution before more developed nations, there was no reason why countries like India or China couldn't do the same. In his last essay before his death, in March 1923, Lenin wrote, "We have the advantage that the whole world is now passing to a movement that must give rise to a world socialist revolution. The entire East, with its hundreds of millions of exploited working people, reduced to the last degree of human suffering, has been forced into a position where its physical and material strength cannot possibly be compared with the physical, material and military strength of any of the much smaller Western European states. In the last analysis, the outcome of the struggle will be determined by the fact that Russia, India, China, etc. account for the overwhelming majority of the population of the globe. And during the past few years, it is this majority that has been drawn into the struggle for emancipation with extraordinary rapidity. So that in this respect, there cannot be the slightest doubt what the final outcome of the world struggle will be. In this sense, the complete victory of socialism is fully and absolutely assured." If the goal was indeed a world Soviet Socialist Republic, victories in India and China would already cover nearly half of it. Lenin was sure that these masses would rise up as a revolutionary force and once developed, would be able to overcome the much smaller Western capitalist countries. Lenin wasn't the only one. After the German Revolution failed to materialize, most Bolsheviks, including Trotsky and Stalin, replaced Germany in their minds with China as the primary object of their revolutionary theories and fantasies. The importance of the East for the world revolution was clear to all. Then, what was the path to revolution there? In Russia, the February Revolution, officially called the February Bourgeois Democratic Revolution, was the first stage, and it had meant establishing a bourgeois democracy in the place of the previous feudal monarchy. Most anti-imperialist groups in the early 20th century were indeed bourgeois nationalist in nature, mostly composed of intellectuals who wanted a revolution to get rid of feudalism and colonialism and to develop industry and capitalism. So, this first stage would be executed by a diverse collection of different groups: liberals, social democrats, nationalists, anarchists, socialists, communists, and others. Despite not being socialist in nature, these nationalist bourgeois revolutions were seen as a necessary pre-step for advancing towards socialism. After the first stage, a second stage, socialist proletarian revolution, would become possible and inevitable, just as the October Revolution had followed the February Revolution. The communists would gain power from the other groups and start moving the country towards socialist development. The reactionary forces included in the first revolution, such as liberals or nationalists, would no longer be necessary and would become the ones being revolted against as communists would take control through a second revolution. This was treated as the scientific model of revolution, and it could be exported anywhere. For Western European nations, it was concluded that the first stage had already been achieved, so the strategy was about workers fighting capitalism and reaching the second revolution. In colonial or underdeveloped countries, however, the focus was to be on the first stage, and that required very different strategies to achieve. As Lenin described it in 1919 and 1920, this meant that it was necessary to struggle against medieval survivals and not against capitalism, and that all communist parties must assist the bourgeois democratic liberation movement in these countries. As a consequence, the Comintern didn't just support purely leftist movements in the colonial countries. Rather, they told the local communist parties to support the wider nationalist movements and actually discouraged them from attempting direct socialist revolutions. Any arguments for skipping stages were denounced as utopian. The initial focus was on anti-imperialism rather than attempting socialism. According to this logic, Comintern was willing to fund non-communist revolutionary groups as well. These kinds of anti-imperialist alliances between leftists and nationalists required by the first stage revolution came to be referred to with the term United Front. The United Front policy. The United Front policy became the official line of the Comintern during its fourth Congress in late 1922. The policy entailed that while in the United Front with the nationalist and bourgeois parties, the leftists would gradually promote their own cause and become more powerful in preparation for taking over later. The core idea was to increase communist influence to the non-communist groups while resisting influence from them. Indeed, one danger was that the United Front could work in reverse and de-radicalize the communists. A warning about this was given by the Comintern. To interpret the United Front as an organizational fusion of all the workers' parties must of course be categorically repudiated. The existence of independent communist parties and their complete freedom of action in relation to the bourgeoisie and the counter-revolutionary social democracy is the most important historical achievement of the proletariat, and one which the communists will in no circumstances renounce. Since even the non-communist parties had workers participating and supporting them, allying with those parties was a means to reach those workers. the United Front tactic is simply an initiative whereby the communists propose to join with all the workers belonging to other parties and groups and all unaligned workers in a common struggle to defend the immediate basic interests of the working class against the bourgeoisie. Every action, for even the most trivial everyday demand, can lead to revolutionary awareness and revolutionary education. It is the experience of struggle that will convince workers of the inevitability of revolution and the historic importance of communism. While some leftists critiqued the Comintern for abandoning so-called proper proletarian internationalism by promoting united fronts with non-communists, the World Revolution was still obviously a large factor in the policy. Even if the United Front made a slight detour on the path to World Revolution, it still fundamentally aimed at contributing to it eventually. Further, having bourgeois nationalist revolutions in colonial countries aimed to weaken global capitalism in general. After all, decolonization threatened the economies of great powers and would weaken imperialism everywhere. Since the United Front policy relied on the two-stage revolution theory as its foundation, whether a united front was needed or not depended on the stage of development. Unfortunately, which countries exactly were developed enough for each stage was not always easy to determine. In fact, initially it had not been clear even in Russia, where it had been debated whether the second stage had been reached with the October Revolution, or only later in 1918, or perhaps only in 1921, or whether the second stage had been reached at all, since full communism had not been implemented yet. The interpretation that the October Revolution was indeed the second stage only came retrospectively. Similar uncertainties came up across the world. As one example, the Japanese communists initially placed Japan as an advanced capitalist country. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was deemed as the Stage 1 bourgeois revolution. This meant that the Japanese radicals themselves believed their organizations should prepare for a proletarian revolution. However, the Comintern had an Asian-wide policy based on Indian and Chinese conditions. In the 1920s, they still saw Japan as a semi-feudal, non-democratic Asian monarchy. So, the Comintern orders for the Japanese were to establish a united front with the bourgeois nationalists to abolish feudalism in Japan, something that many of the Japanese radicals themselves believed had already occurred 50 years earlier. Comintern only reversed this stance in 1927 and admitted that Japan was indeed a bourgeois monarchy that should work directly towards a socialist revolution. Too often the Comintern had insufficient information about local conditions and simply applied the same policies with broad strokes. In many places, there were competing groups asking for support, which made it even harder to determine who was right and what the real situation was. Colonial Korea in the early 1920s is a prime example, as numerous leftist and non-leftist factions fought between each other continuously. The Comintern could only repeat year after year their recommendations for a united front. However, this proved to be totally impossible for almost a decade, as the ideological differences and personal grudges were just too many. The communists were unable to even unite amongst themselves, let alone form a united front with others. Generally, in 1920s East Asia, communist movements were small and heavily dependent on the Comintern for their funding. It was far more advantageous for them to follow the official line whether they personally agreed with it or not. Rebelling against the orders could mean that the funding would go to a competing group. On the other hand, these movements were much less professional and much less educated than their counterparts in Europe, and they were quite far away from Moscow. This sometimes allowed them more space to be autonomous, just based on the slowness of communication, language barriers, and the lack of capabilities for the Comintern to meddle in their affairs. Additionally, in the early 1920s, the Comintern was not yet the be-all end-all authority on revolutionary strategy. The United Front policy was often seen as impractical by local radicals. The Comintern itself was not always unanimous. While the Russian influence was strong and the organization was slowly becoming more and more centralized, the member parties could still go against the general line and argue based on their differing national circumstances in the 1920s. There were no obvious right answers to follow, so theory had to be developed on the fly. This sometimes led to confusing policy switches and conflicts with disagreeing parties. In any case, despite all the problems, the United Front policy based on the two-stage revolution theory became the central Comintern tenet in 1922. To really understand what this meant in practice, let's look at examples of it in action. The first United Front in China between 1924 and 1927. The rise of the United Front in China. Already in 1918, Moscow was sending messages to China about a potential alliance with Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the Nationalist Party of China, the Comintern. He had played a leading part in toppling the Qing dynasty in 1911. These early Soviet attempts to influence China underlined anti-imperialism without much care about the politics of their potential partners, as there were barely any communists in China at that point. At the same time, Sun Yat-sen himself was relatively open to some socialist-leaning policies, as can be seen from his famous Three Principles of the People that promoted social welfare and land reform, among other things. Chinese leftists too started to get more contacts with Russia from 1919 onwards, and there was a growing interest in Russian language and culture. At first, it was mostly through retranslating English translations of Russian texts that came from the US, but as the civil war in Russia calmed down, materials were starting to come directly from Russia. Instead of studying in Japan or going to work study in France as was popular for a time, Moscow gradually became the most central site for revolutionary hopes of young Chinese looking to go abroad. The Communist Party of China, the CPC, started to take its form in late 1920, with its official first congress in June 1921, in large part thanks to Comintern's insistence and support. In the first congress of the CPC in Shanghai, 2 of the 13 attendants were Comintern representatives, and Moscow was already funding various leftist activities and projects. With the CPC established and the KMT already supported by Comintern, it was only natural that China became a testing ground for the United Front policy. The young CPC was told right away to cooperate fully with the KMT and aim for a bourgeois nationalist revolution, as the conditions in China could not yet support a socialist revolution directly. Indeed, at the time, the country was split into competing governments and rebelling warlords, in addition to having parts of its territory under the colonial influence of Western powers and Japan. The immediate goals promoted by the Comintern were anti-colonial independence and the unification of the country. For the time, the KMT was the only faction strong enough to do this. The Chinese communists themselves were often not happy with the Comintern orders. Most of them had been introduced to communism through earlier writings where the two-stage revolution was not yet promoted. Initially in 1917 to 1919, the Bolsheviks had believed in an immediate world revolution everywhere, and this is what most Chinese communists believed as well. The alliance with the KMT was voted down in the First Party Congress in 1921, and the Comintern advisors there were not much liked. The proposed alliance was also criticized on the basis that the nationalist bourgeois in China were so undeveloped that they could not be trusted to successfully carry a revolution, and that trying to turn the KMT into a revolutionary party was hopeless. Such resistance could not last long. Already in 1922, the CPC agreed formally to the alliance in order to please the Comintern, but it did nothing to advance it concretely. Attitudes only started to properly change when more Chinese had had experiences in the Soviet Union and started taking the Comintern position as their own. When the United Front was again debated in the Third Party Congress of the CPC in 1923, it passed the vote. Finally, in 1924, Sun Yat-sen's policy of ally with Russia, tolerate communists, officially and concretely established the First United Front, as it is known in English. China was now a prototype for the United Front policy in colonial contexts. The CPC initially argued on at least retaining its own independent party structure and organizing the United Front as a cross-party alliance of 2 equal partners, but Sun Yat-sen would not accept this. Instead, the CPC members had to directly join the KMT. In Sun Yat-sen's view, this arrangement reflected the power balance between the parties most realistically. Most of the communists, including future leaders like Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, joined the KMT while simultaneously holding their CPC membership. The KMT was already aware of the communists' plan to increase their own status through the alliance and wanted to minimize their influence. The CPC members were often better trained and experienced at organizing, which led to many of them quickly reaching high positions within the KMT. They were also able to grow their numbers very quickly, from less than 1,000 members in January of 1925 to around 30,000 members by mid-1926. While some communists became supporters of this system, there was also a continued criticism among the communist leadership. The CPC leaders would continuously keep asking for the front to be disbanded for the next 3 years. Meanwhile, from the Comintern's perspective, everything was set in 1924 just as they had hoped. A large, non-communist party was leading a bourgeois nationalist revolution against feudal and colonial forces, namely the warlords, and the smaller communist party was helping it while growing its own influence. The fall of the United Front in China. The relations between the CPC and the KMT started to get worse after the KMT leader Sun Yat-sen died in March 1925, and the more militaristic Chiang Kai-shek started his struggle to the top. The KMT contained both rightist and leftist factions within it, which led into an intra-party conflict for the power vacuum left over by Sun's death. By 1926, the situation was getting more and more complex, and Chiang was increasingly worried about the powers of the communists and their threat to his position. Bloodless arrest of communists and other Chiang's opponents in March of 1926 in Guangzhou ended the hopes of the left to get into power through political maneuvering. At this point, the CPC leader, Chen Du-xiu, once again asked to exit the United Front, but the Comintern refused once more. They still insisted that the United Front was the correct policy and said it was working as intended. Meanwhile, the Comintern itself was part of a power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin back in Moscow. Trotsky himself had started to support disbanding the United Front, but Stalin opposed this. The personal conflict restricted policy choices Comintern could make, as the policies got tied to the personal reputations of the leaders. Maintaining the United Front was in part about maintaining Stalin's image. The entire strategy was becoming untenable, as the CPC was told to increase its powers relative to the KMT while not risking the United Front in any way. The KMT was still much stronger, and with Chiang in the lead, communist advances were not tolerated at all. At the same time, Chiang went on to start a military campaign called the Northern Expedition in order to defeat the warlords in the north and finally reunite China. The central moment for the United Front came in the spring of 1927. The KMT, already in a more or less open civil war between its left and right factions, decided that the communists still had too much power after the initial purges. This culminated in the city of Shanghai. As of March 1927, Shanghai was under warlord control, and the communists led a number of worker uprisings against them, organized by figures like Zhou Enlai and Chen Du-xiu. The KMT's National Revolutionary Army, as part of the Northern Expedition, were approaching the city at the same time. As Chiang's army reached Shanghai in the first days of April, the city had effectively been taken over by the local striking workers. The communists appealed that Chiang's army would not need to enter the city at all, fearing that he would put the strikes down. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership still regarded Chiang as a centrist and someone necessary for the revolution. Despite increasingly alarming signs, it was insisted that the CPC made concessions to Chiang in early 1927 to make sure that the front stayed together. Having to follow Comintern orders once again, the workers let the troops enter Shanghai without resistance and even celebrated the defeat of the warlords with them. On April 5th, Stalin spoke about Chiang Kai-shek. He may have no sympathy for the revolution, but he directs the army and cannot do anything else but direct it against the imperialists. On April 6th, the workers in Shanghai received a message from the CPC leadership. The Comintern has ordered us to hide or bury all the weapons to avoid clashes between the workers and Chiang's army. The workers refused to hand over the weapons or be placed under the control of Chiang. The situation in Shanghai remained tense for days. The CPC itself was also divided on whether they should prepare for a direct conflict with Chiang or follow the Comintern line. This distracted any preparations for the worst. Amid this confusion, Chiang had already made up his plan for the next move. On April 11th, Chiang Kai-shek started the Shanghai Massacre that lasted for 5 days, killing at least 5,000 real or suspected communists and workers. Those who could fled the city, including future Premier Zhou Enlai. He bitterly noted that the Comintern must also bear responsibility for what has happened. The initial massacre was soon followed by the White Terror, an even larger nationwide purge of communists by the KMT. In the following years, tens of thousands of workers and peasants died as a result. The KMT famously proclaimed in a slogan that it is better to kill 1,000 innocents rather than let a single guilty one escape. As a result of the massacre, the United Front was beyond repair, and the Soviet advisors lost much of their credibility for having promoted a policy that almost led to the destruction of the entire Chinese Communist movement. At the same time, the CPC, again in a very weakened state, were forced to stick with the Soviets. The Comintern did its best to deflect all criticism and instead, ironically, blamed Chen Du-xiu, the CPC leader, for being responsible for the policies that he had opposed all along. The events in China were coupled with the breakdown of Soviet relations with England and the increasing conflict between Trotsky and Stalin. Together, all this led to the Comintern entering its so-called third period. It was claimed that capitalism was now in a state of collapse and thus the proletariat must engage in direct class war. United fronts with any non-communists were denounced in a complete U-turn compared with the previous policy, and even social democrats were branded as social fascists. The latest slogan was "class against class." In line with this, the CPC decided to seek actively the overthrow of the Comintern government. The necessity of proletarian revolutions were highlighted once again, and the plan was to start urban worker uprisings across the cities of China. This proved to be rather difficult since the proletariat was still not highly developed in the mostly agrarian country. The Chinese tried nonetheless.
Some thought communism in China forever quenched, but Mao Zedong did not. He had escaped and watched in hiding. He would return to fight another day.
While the United Front as a policy never returned in the form as it was in the 1920s, the term continued to find new meanings. For the sake of clarity, let's look at the use of the term more generally and in the later decades of the Chinese Civil War. United fronts and popular fronts. A note on terminology. There are indeed some further complications to the term United Front. As you might have noticed, this alliance in China we just discussed is commonly called in English the First United Front. It was a joint effort by the leftists and the nationalists to have a bourgeois national revolution, with the left simultaneously using the alliance to grow their own power for a future proletarian revolution. This is more or less the exact definition of a united front as coined by the Comintern. However, there was also the so-called Second United Front between the KMT and CPC from 1937 to 1945 against the Japanese during the Second World War. In the precise Comintern usage of the term, only the first alliance here can be genuinely labeled as a united front. The later anti-Japanese alliance is part of a different Comintern policy called the Popular Front. This was a strategy to unite between all pro-democratic forces in order to combat fascism. It was established by the Comintern in 1934 due to the developments in Germany and the Japanese advance into Manchuria. The rhetoric about social democrats being social fascists and the need for direct proletarian revolutions became increasingly silly at a time when actual fascists were massively gaining power and most of the communist parties were getting outlawed and losing members. Naturally, these conditions necessitated the shift in tactics. These popular fronts were often unstable and in the long run unsuccessful in resisting fascism in most cases, at least in places like Germany, Spain and France. They had a tendency to eventually collapse due to the internal contradictions of the interclass alliance and resurfacing of their past conflicts. While the United Front aimed to get rid of feudal or colonial structures, the Popular Front had no revolutionary intentions at all. It was purely a defensive tactic to combat fascism through military means or through politics, usually both. The second alliance between the CPC and the KMT fits the general concept of a Popular Front fairly well. The two sides allied only for the duration of fighting against the Japanese invasion and then immediately continued their civil war afterwards. With the memories of over 10 years of war behind them, the two sides obviously had a lot of bad history already when the Japanese attacked. In fact, Chiang Kai-shek had to literally be kidnapped by his own subordinate generals to accept joining the alliance at all in late 1936. At the same time, the Chinese communists were much less tied to the Comintern than in the past. Joining up with the nationalists was not something forced on them by the Comintern, but more of a result of their own strategic planning and the uniting factor of anti-Japanese nationalism on both sides. So, the first United Front in the 20s was indeed a United Front, while the second United Front during the Second World War was really a Popular Front. After the Chinese Civil War, the term United Front has gained yet another meaning. It describes the Communist Party-led alliance in mainland China's political system that includes all the minor political parties and a variety of other political groups, including representatives of overseas Chinese, of regions like Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan, of ethnic and religious minorities, and so on. This political alliance is coordinated by the United Front Work Department. These types of multi-party political alliances are sometimes called People's Fronts or National Fronts in other countries. This is likely the context where you might hear the term United Front, but it is obviously quite different from what was meant by it in the past. Outside these specific meanings, tons of organizations have just used United Front or Popular Front as parts of their names or descriptions without directly referring to the concepts mentioned here. Despite all the differences and adaptations of these terms, it is still useful to know that in some contexts they do have quite specific meanings. Conclusions. What can we take away from these events for today's political problems? Obviously, how leftist unity should be approached, or whether leftist groups should associate themselves with non-leftist groups for political goals, are still big questions right now. I don't think we can get a very good answer from the Comintern policies of almost 100 years ago, but in a way they are still part of the same never-ending debate. For me, one lesson from the Chinese Revolution is that it seems to be incorrect to assume that there can be an all-encompassing scientific way of doing revolution or left-wing politics in general that could simply just be exported across the world. It was a misreading or simply dogmatism from the Comintern to believe that every country required a two-stage revolution just because it had occurred like that in Russia. Mao's alternative rural-based peasant revolution and protracted People's War were certainly much more effective for taking power in China, though that model also has then gone on to fail elsewhere and should not be thought of as universal either. Unsurprisingly, specific circumstances and conditions have to always be taken into account. Secondly, the changes in Comintern policies depended way too much on the personal conflicts of the USSR leadership rather than real analysis. The United Front policy is a good example of this, since it existed far longer than it needed to just because it was tied to Stalin personally. Had they listened to the CPC leadership more about what was really going on in China, perhaps the worst purges could have been avoided. I hope you liked the video and learned something new. I'm positively surprised I managed to release a second video within a month from the first, since I'm still kind of getting used to the process of making videos. If you haven't seen my first video on Soviet internationalism, I recommend you go check it out. Thematically, it goes quite well with this one. As always, I had to simplify a lot and leave some major people out of the narrative, so this was by no means the whole story on this topic. I'd be thankful for any feedback on any aspect of this video. The content, the graphics, my voice, whatever. Please reach out to me in the comments or anywhere else. Also check the link to the script in the description for all the references, additional credits and so on. You can always follow me on Twitter and, of course, here on YouTube, subscribing, liking and commenting always helps. See you in the next video and thanks for watching.